And please join me in welcoming Dr. Noah Bickart.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Ed, and thanks, Bonnie. I'm really honored to be here and to be giving this lecture as part of Mission Week, and I think it says a great deal of sort of what's going on at this institution, that the scholar of Jewish studies is giving a big evening lecture during Mission Week. And in many ways, the sort of content of tonight's lecture and the form in which it takes during Mission Week really reflect each other very nicely. Because in some ways, while we might think that things like having a Jewish studies professor in a Jesuit Catholic institution is somehow new in history, the point I'm going to attempt to make is that in some ways these kinds of interactions are in fact very, very old. And that this is not the first time in Jewish or Christian history that Jews and Christians have encountered each other as peers in a kind of democratic marketplace of religious ideas. But in fact, that late antiquity might serve as a model for what's going on. And therefore, the title of this talk, my notion that there is a tale of two saffron growers, really stems from a Talmudic story I want to teach to you in some detail. But I want to read to you very briefly the way that the book begins, which is a sort of fictional account. And these two saffron growers, who I imagine as a Jew and a Christian in the late 4th century in what we would call Iraq, but was then Sasanian Babylonia, really can sort of serve as a model for a kind of partnership that we're actually manifesting in our department and in this university. Theodoros and Yehuda had been friends since childhood when this story takes place on a bright sunny day in the year 340 CE. The two had grown up together, spending their long summer days fishing in the muddy, slow-moving water of the Tigris. Their hometown was called, depending on the language and dialect, Machoza, Choka, or Way Ardashir, in which a variety of Aramaic-speaking religious groups, Jews, Mandaeans, and Christians, mingled in peace. Babylonia, they joked, was by its very nature a place of mixture. And for those of you who are familiar with the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, in many ways this notion of Babel meaning, and we even use that in modern English, to Babel as a sort of confusing mixture of different kinds of things. This is a very old pun. Just across the river, however, was the Persian winter capital, Ctesiphon. Theodoros and Yehuda had been venturing there since adolescence, crossing one of the two majestic bridges to wander in the fancy shops in which the Persian-speaking aristocrats bought silk, glass, and spices. The two boys could read enough Persian to make do if they had to, but they found the Zoroastrian administrative center to be strange. While they knew that it was the king of kings, of the Iranians and non-Iranians who ruled the empire in which they lived, their identities were hybrid Babylonian ones, in which the mixing and matching of cultures was normal. Their grandfathers had arrived in Persian Babylonia at around the same time as captives, more or less forcibly relocated from Roman Palestine to the very heart of the Persian Empire by Shapur I. But by the time these boys had come into the world, Babylonia was the only home that either had ever known. Their families and communities knew how to evade the Zoroastrian priests who would occasionally bother them for lighting fires indoors, or for having the gumption to bathe in water and not cow urine, which is normal Persian practice. But for the most part, their own religious customs were respected. The boys grew up to be saffron farmers, following their father's professions, which enabled a good enough life. And they worked alongside one another not infrequently, taking breaks to sit in the shade to share the stories they had heard all their lives. That Theodoros was Christian and Yehuda Jewish was totally unremarkable. Sometimes they even swapped funny stories of their own religious leaders with their funny Palestinian accents, and paused to ponder why it was that the God in whom they both believed could possibly have commanded Abraham to sacrifice his only son. It was only on the Sabbath that they did not work side by side. As they grew older, they decided to go into business together. It was only this small sticking point of how to divide the money made on the Sabbath that led to potential conflict. After pondering it alone for a while, Yehuda invited his friend to come with him to ask the advice of the most famous rabbi in Machoza, Rav Abba, the son of Yosef Bar Hama. Right, so this fictional account of my sort of model of these two saffron farmers, one Jewish and one Christian, who are sort of engaged in partnership. I don't know if this is a real story, right? But it's true, even if it didn't happen, as we like to say in religious studies courses. Comes from a text in the Babylonian Talmud, which I have here on the screen. We've decided not to kill the trees, and instead simply just present the texts on the screen. We'll see how it goes. And this is a somewhat normal text from the Babylonian Talmud, which is a compendium of Jewish wisdom from this time period, which will collect questions that arose in this culture, mostly religious legal questions. Okay? So we have two saffron growers, a Gentile who took charge of the field on Shabbat, and the Jew who took charge of the field on Sunday came before Rava, this great sage. Okay? So clearly, the Jewish saffron grower is unable, according to his own religious tradition, to work on the Sabbath. And yet wants to engage in partnership. So how should they arrange it such that he doesn't benefit from labor performed on the Sabbath? And seemingly, if the non-Jewish partner is able to sort of get the proceeds of work done on Saturday, and the Jewish partner will take Wednesday in a sort of balancing act, that would seem to solve the problem. And indeed, Rava, the sage, allows it. However, a student sitting before Rava, named Ravina, objected and quoted another source, really about just this topic. Okay? Should a Jew and Gentile lease a field in partnership, the Jew should not say to the Gentile, take your share on the Sabbath and I on a weekday. Okay? So here we have an authoritative early source which seems precisely to preclude the kind of business arrangement that these two folks have set up for themselves. If they stipulate such a scheme before taking possession, it is permitted. But if they calculate the profit, it is forbidden. So seemingly, if they were to set up some system in advance to figure out how much money is made on Saturday and how much money made on some other day of the week, that would be okay. But if it's only in retrospect, that would be a problem. And thus, as the Aramaic text says, ichsif, Rava was shamed, okay, for having permitted this partnership in direct violation of this authoritative source. However, lucky for Rava at this stage in the argument, eventually it was revealed that in the case above, the arrangement had been stipulated before they took possession. Right? So if you're Rava who has allowed them to do this, and then been embarrassed by an authoritative text quoted against that, he must have felt very relieved. Phew, I gave the right ruling after all. As long as they set up the scheme beforehand, all is well. Okay. Rav Gaviha, the text continues, of Bei Katil, another rabbinic sage, says, in a sense, it wasn't really about Shabbat at all. It had nothing to do with the Sabbath. In fact, it was a case of orla fruit. There's a somewhat strange biblical law in Leviticus 19, which says that trees growing in the land of Israel, that one is not allowed to eat their produce for the first 3 years of a tree's life. Okay? It's called orla. Orla technically means foreskin. Maybe we won't get into that aspect of this law. Okay? But in fact, you could see how it is a sort of a parallel kind of case. That if the non-Jewish partner were to consume the fruits from these trees in the first 3 years, that's fine. And then the Jewish partner would then take over the usage of the fruits afterwards. Okay? Well, okay, they came before Rava, who permitted it. In other words, we have two variant versions of the same story. One in which it's a case about the Sabbath, the other in which it's a case about this fruit. To which the voice of the Talmud now is deeply confused. It says, wait a second, but didn't Ravina cite a statement in objection to Rava's ruling? The way that we told the story, it now doesn't make any sense. Right? Given that Ravina quotes a text about the Sabbath to say, hey, you can't allow them to do that, If it wasn't about the Sabbath, what did that mean? Why was that text quoted at all? It doesn't seem to make any sense. To which the Talmud responds, no, that was in order to support it. In other words, the reason why that text about the Sabbath was proffered was to say it's only problematic when it comes to engaging with partnerships about the Sabbath. That's the only place where there's a problem. But when it comes to orla fruit, there's no problem. Because we've almost reread the text. To which the Talmud then says, that doesn't work. How could that be? He was shamed. Right? Rava was embarrassed when this text that was quoted against his position. So how can the Talmud now be telling me that in fact that wasn't the case at all? Right? That shame demonstrates that it really was a case of the Sabbath. To which the Talmud essentially gaslights us, its reader, and says, Lo hayu dvarim me'olam. That never happened. Okay? So your chuckles, right? People have been studying this text for at least 1,500 years, and they have responded precisely the same way that you just responded, right? And in fact, this next text I have, text number 2, demonstrates that you are not the first people in history to have chuckled in precisely that way. Here we have a responsum, a 9th century responsum of a much later Babylonian rabbi who is asked precisely this kind of question, which is, this text makes no sense as it's written. Can you please explicate it for us? And he says as following. Since there are 2 versions of this tradition, right, the first one in which it seems to be a question about the Sabbath, and the second version in which it seems to be a question about the orla fruit trees, the halacha is in accordance with the second version of Rav Gavia. Okay? Rav Natronae here is attempting to adjudicate by particular kinds of rules. That is to say, he is telling his audience when the Talmud presents multiple cases which seem to contradict one another, we go by the last one. Okay? Which is a very useful principle in trying to figure out which one should make sense. But the reason why I'm interested in this is because he argues, actually, that this text represents the Talmud itself coming into being, that there's something about this text where you can see how it was produced. Somehow the seams and the things that don't quite make sense seem to suggest how this text comes to be. He continues, when the scholars studied this tradition as they were sitting in the siyuma, and I don't want to translate siyuma just yet, they objected. But Ravina objected to Rava on the basis of a Tannaitic tradition. And this is precisely how he is understanding the end of this story. Okay? The scholars answered, it never happened. And thus the pericope concluded. In other words, what Rav Natronae Gaon is attempting to argue to his readers is that what this text, that doesn't make sense to us, really is almost a live transcript of an academic enterprise, where different stories were told, different traditions were brought, different challenges were raised, and that what we see here is that there's an institution in the scholastic home where this was studied, where certain scholars had to arrange these things in an order that could be memorized and collated and passed on. And that what we see in this text is that these scholars attempted to bring multiple versions of traditions and eventually to harmonize them and to promulgate them. And therefore, I want to focus in on this siyuma, this particular scholastic practice, because it's a fascinating one, as I hope you will see. So I'm going to tell you 2 stories about the siyuma, or 2 additional Talmudic texts in which this comes up. And so the third text here is a famous story from Bava Kama. I joked I was giving a talk to the Sarah Club recently, in which the priest there talked about a famous verse in the letter to the Hebrews, and I whispered obnoxiously to one of the folks in the room. I said, "You know what famous means when a religious leader says it?" He said, "No." I said, "It means I know about it." Right? So it's famous in that sense. Okay, here is a story of Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana has gotten into deep trouble in Babylonia And his teacher, Rav, insists that he flee this trouble in Babylonia and to run away to the land of Israel and to hide out in an academy in the land of Israel. Now, the characters in this story are characters who lived in the 3rd century. But it's almost impossible that the text as we have it reflects the realia of the 3rd century, but rather reflects the realia of the time period of those who told the story as opposed to the characters who lived in that story. Think about when you go to the Cleveland Museum of Art and you look at, at Renaissance painting of biblical scenes, and it sure looks like 16th century or 17th century Italy and not ancient land of Israel, right? Sometimes when we tell stories about the past, we retroject our own understandings upon them, and that's what I think is going on in this story. Even though the characters come from the 3rd century, the details of academic life come from much later, okay? Rav Kahana, remember, who has now fled Babylonia and is running away to an academy in the land of Israel, went and found Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is a famous sage who is sitting and promulgating, and in Hebrew, misayim, it's precisely the same word as this word I was using before, siyuma. He is promulgating the lesson of the day for the rabbis. He seems to be doing this procedure, whatever it is, of collating certain kinds of texts and ideas. Kahana said to them, "Where is Reish Lakish?" They said to him, "Why?" He noted this problem and that problem, and this solution and that solution. So seemingly, whatever the siyuma is, whatever Reish Lakish is doing, he has collated the material from yesterday's class and presented it in such a way that this Babylonian sage who wasn't in class yesterday can now participate in the discourse, can ask questions, can provide answers. He knows all he needs to know in order to participate. They told Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish went and said to Rabbi Yochanan, the head honcho of this academy in the land of Israel, "A lion has come up from Babylonia. Oh, let the master prepare tomorrow's lecture carefully." Right? My faculty colleagues know that when you have a student who has deeply, carefully prepared the material, it's incumbent on the professor to prepare that much harder in order to handle all of the good questions that the students will ask. However, the next day they sat Kahana in the first row before Rabbi Yochanan. We learned something else about these scholastic procedures, that the students sit in rows according to their ability. Right? So the first row is where the tip-top students sit. I'll say nothing about the population of the front rows. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan quoted one tradition and Kahana doesn't say anything. And another tradition and Kahana does not raise any difficulties. And therefore they placed Kahana progressively further back through the 7 rows until he sat in the last row. Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, another name for this man, Reish Lakish, "The lion of whom you spoke has become a fox." Right? He's not doing anything. He's not showing himself to be an erudite student. He's asked no good questions. He's provided no good answers. What is going on? And at this point, Rav Kahana, who is, remember, he's in hiding. Right? He doesn't want to display who he is. He's had enough. Okay? And he says to Rabbi Yochanan, "Let the master start from the beginning. Go back." Okay? And again, we must understand here that this is not a sort of free-form discussion, that there's texts which have a particular kind of order, such that there's a beginning to start from. So, Rabbi Yochanan begins, quotes a tradition, and Rav Kahana raises a difficulty. They placed him in the first row. He quoted a tradition, and Kahana raised a difficulty. Rabbi Yochanan was sitting on 7 cushions. He quoted a tradition, and Rav Kahana raised difficulty, and 1 cushion was pulled out from under him with every good question that he asked until Rabbi Yochanan is literally cut down to size. Okay, so we see something, again, about the siyuma here, that this process of collecting a variety of traditions, such that a sage could hear that distillation of the traditions and understand the memorized form of it in order to be able to ask good questions, is precisely what this activity, the siyuma, seems to have been. And I'll give you another example of it, another wonderful and strange and slightly morbid story from the Talmud. Okay? Here, also from Tractate Bava Batra, Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak was the Reish Kala. Okay? Kala seems to be another kind of scholastic activity. And if we think that these terms are sort of strange, I mean, think about it. We have our own scholastic terms. We have a seminar. We have a lecture. We have a review period. You have a TA in 1,000 years when they discover the one hard drive that's been preserved and they find these terms. I mean, how will scholars think about how it worked? Okay, so Nachman Bar Yitzchak, another sage, seems to be the head of a particular scholastic process. Every day before he entered the Kala, he would review his material with Rav Ada Bar Abba and then would enter the Kala. Okay, so and again, maybe I'm retrojecting too much from my own experience, but among the things that professors do for the students in the room, sometimes the professor will talk through it with a colleague or with a graduate student to sort of prepare in advance for the lesson, and that's probably what's going on. Okay, but one day, here we have a challenge to the normal mode of events. Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yehoshua, approached Rav Ada Bar Abba, who's sort of the TA who's supposed to help the professor prepare, because they had not been present at the Siyuma. Okay, they weren't there. They were members of this scholastic group, but they had missed a day, right? They took a mental health day or something like that. They said to him, "Teach us of the traditions of the tithing of cattle as arranged by Rava." Okay, so they want to know, what did we miss in class yesterday? He said to them, Rava said such and such. And again, they were unable to be in the Siyuma, so they were not present when these traditions were ordered in these particular kinds of ways. And yet, asking for it to be transmitted to them enables him to really understand what had happened in the day before, such that all of the traditions were ordered in a particular kind of way. Now, that's well and good for these two rabbis who had skipped school the other day, but meanwhile, the professor is waiting for his TA. Okay? Meanwhile, it was getting late for Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, and Ada Bar Abba had not yet come. The student said to him, "Come, for it is getting late. Let the master sit and teach." In other words, the professor who was supposed to go over the material and was unable to go over the material has waited this whole time, and the poor students are sitting there waiting. And he said, the master says, "I am sitting and waiting for the bier of Ada Bar Abba," right? The coffin of Ada Bar Abba. Maybe says this in jest. And boom, just like that, a report came that Ada Bar Abba had died. Right? It seems like the professor has such power, right, to just muse about the death of his junior colleague that's enough to cause his death. Okay. So we have these two stories in which the Siyuma, once again, seems to be a scholastic period, a part of the life of the academy, in which disparate texts, which during the normal goings-on of the academy are sort of thrown out as live questions or proffered as responses to those kinds of questions, that live dialogue has somehow been collected into some sort of easy, memorizable literary form that those who weren't present for that live discussion could somehow learn and memorize and therefore know what was going on. But this scholastic procedure also comes into the terminology of the Talmud itself. Okay, and that's the next text I want to show you from here, from Tractate Megillah, and this is text number 4. Sometimes the Talmud seems to just try to analyze biblical verses. So at the very end of the book of 2 Kings, which narrates the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem around the year 586 BC, we have this verse from 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 9, that says, "Et kol beit gadol saraf ba'esh," that the Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, burned all the great houses with fire. But of course, in the Jewish rabbinic midrashic imagination, we're never sort of content with the plain contextual sense of a verse, but rather, what is this Beit Gadol? And in Hebrew, it's a slightly bizarre grammatical formulation, because probably means house of a great one. Not big house, but the house of a great one. So who is this great one? Whose great one's house was burned with fire? Okay? So we have two opinions about this. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Chad Amar, well, I'll read it in English. One of them said the place where the Torah is magnified. The other one said the place where a prayer is magnified. So a note about the form and a note about the content. In terms of the content, these two sages are trying to interpret the same verse. One of them is saying, what is the house of the great one? Well, there are only two options. It's either the study house, the Beit Midrash, the place where Torah is studied, or it's the synagogue, a house of prayer, where God is praised. These are the two ways that this verse will be analyzed. And in terms of the form, note that the Talmud knows who the two rabbis are who are arguing with one another, and it knows the positions that are taken by those rabbis. But in the long course of oral transmission, it seems that we've forgotten who said what. And this is the task of the text. Okay? Now, I want to skip a little bit. The Talmud then gives support for both sides. These are both reasonable interpretations, because great house could mean place of prayer. It could also mean place of study. These are both reasonable approaches. And my colleagues frequently tease me for arguing both sides of every argument in department meetings, right, which doesn't always endear me to my colleagues who want to leave on time. But I say, I'm a Talmudist. What can I possibly do? This is exactly what the whole tradition is about, in justifying both sides of every argument. But if you look at the final section here, okay, it may be promulgated, tistayim, exactly the same word as the siyuma. Let it be promulgated that it was Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi who said the place where the Torah is magnified. That is, despite the fact that the tradent, the person who said the opinion, has become disconnected from the opinion itself, right? The Talmud now wants to put the pieces back together, and on the basis of other material, figure out which rabbi said what. Okay? Why? Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said that a synagogue may be turned into a study house as opposed to the opposite. Okay, given that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi thinks that you can turn a synagogue into a study house, but not the other way around, shows that he's the one who thinks that study is more important than prayer. And if study is therefore the most important thing, well, that must be the great house that has been spoken about in the Book of Kings. To which the Talmud responds, Tistayim, let it be promulgated. Right, so I'm arguing that this notion of the siyuma, this place where scholars sat, and ultimately having had access to a variety of different traditions, sometimes which contradict one another, because they have access to so many traditions, have the ability to order them, to decide what must make sense, and then to sort of compose in a literary form a text, an oral text which could be memorized. And I think, really, that this process happens relatively late in the Talmudic period. Because it's really relatively late in the Talmudic period that we cease to have study groups formed by small disciple circleships, and we begin to see much broader academic institutions. Right? Compare these kinds of models to our favorite first century Judean disciple circleship. Right? Just think about the New Testament for a second. Nobody applies to Jesus' school. Right? There are no semesters. There are no classes. And if the master dies, nobody replaces that master. You follow around your master, and you sit down when he feels like giving you a lecture, and you take in the lecture. And if your master dies, then you go out and hang out a shingle of your own and attract your own disciples. Or if you're not ready yet, you apprentice yourself to another master. And there are a bunch of masters all over the place. And maybe you quote the traditions from another disciple circle, and maybe you don't. And that, by the way, may lead to this fact that one of them said this thing and one of them said that thing, and we don't no longer remember who said what. That's very different from a situation of an academy, where if the head of academy dies, somebody else is promoted in their stead. in which you have these variety of different scholastic situations in which scholars are able to collate material from a variety of different places. And so it seems that the siyuma, this fact of the late Talmudic academies, was a very important development and may even have led to the literary production of the Talmud as we know it. Well, where does this come from? And how did these academies know how to do this? Unfortunately, we don't really know. Most of our data about Talmudic Babylonia comes from the Babylonian Talmud itself. And the Talmud doesn't seem fit to sort of explain to its audience, this is how the academies worked, this is their history, this is what goes on in them, because it assumes that its elite Jewish audience, most of whom study in academies like these, don't need that, because they already know about it. But fortunately for us, Syriac-speaking Christians who live in the exact same time and the exact same place, and who seem to be founding schools in these times and places, in fact tell us a great deal about how they studied in their own institutions. And here we encounter a world of Christianity which is very different from the Western kinds of Christianity that most of us are familiar with, perhaps most in terms of the squiggles that we can see. And this here is yet another dialect of Aramaic. This is the dialect of Syriac. Syriac was once the sort of local Aramaic dialect of Edessa in what is now Turkey, and becomes the dominant lingua franca, the common language of Christians in the Persian Empire in the East. And it is so close to Jewish Babylonian Aramaic that all you have to do is change the font. And if you're familiar with the other dialect of the language, you can understand that. I know this from personal experience. My daughter was born just as I was learning Syriac, and I was exhausted and didn't have time to do my homework when I was learning Syriac. And I got to that, for those of you who know the terror of sitting in a language class and having the teacher call on you. It's one thing to go from the far language to your own language, to translate in public, sight reading it. Maybe you can do it. But this I was asked to translate from English into Syriac. And I remember the sort of challenge I had in my own mind, that I could either admit to the professor that I hadn't done my homework and complain about having a baby at home, and or I could just make it up and say it in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. And those of you who know me probably know exactly what I decided. So I made it up and just said it in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, and I was right. At which point I figured, oh, I guess I know Syriac. And when you mine these texts, you notice that some of the terminology is strikingly similar and eerily familiar almost. So the first text here, and this is really a Syriac translation of a text that was originally written in Greek that we don't have the original Greek for. Okay? Speaking about the Torah, Namosa, for the Torah is greater than any other wisdom or power. There was none greater than Moses. He said nothing of his own accord, but all of it that he placed as law, that he promulgated as law in Syriac, sim namosa. That word sim is precisely the same word as siyuma, as tistayim. It's the same term. Has promulgated this thing, and salvation and wonder that would care for them. Okay. And similarly, this text, Isaac of Nineveh, in many ways, there's a long debate within Syriac Christian culture about the nature, about Jesus' nature and identity, whether one person or two persons, whether Jesus is fully God and fully human at the same time. As I'm always joking to my students, in the ways in which schiza in Christian history usually fall out because of theological questions. This is not usually how schiza happened in Judaism. Judaism tends to divide over, am I allowed to eat that kind of food or not? Or am I allowed to behave in this particular way or not? It's not a theological division, but rather a difference in practice, which leads to the dividing of cultures. Okay, so here is a sort of polemical text, Isaac of Nineveh. Okay. For if God's commandments are performed under the torture of the body and we then reject them, it is clear that we reject him, the giver, the promulgator of the commandments. Here God is presented as Sioma, the one who placed, the one who arranged, the one who promulgated the doctrines found in the Bible. It's very much the same thing. And yet another polemical text within this culture, here accusing the non-Miaphysites of getting it wrong. Okay, this letter of Simeon of Beit Arsham, talking about those he considers to be heretics. Right? They established canons of new faith, different from the ones they had. And they separated themselves. Oh, I got to give this to you. There you go. There it is. They established canons of a new faith, different from the ones they had. And they separated themselves from the true faith of the Holy Fathers. The same notion of establishing, of promulgating, of collecting and publishing almost a particular kind of idea seems to be built into this particular kind of culture. Well, finally, there is a remarkable text from perhaps the institution that we know the most about from late antiquity, and this is the famous School of Nisibis. Nisibis is a town in northern Babylonia, seems to have an incredible influence on the life of the Syriac Christian community from its founding sometime in the 5th century, maybe a little bit earlier, certainly until the Muslim conquests of the 7th century and likely beyond. And in its very title, Elta Desim Motva de Escola, the cause of the establishment of the session of the school, we have exactly for this Syriac school culture what we lack from the Babylonian Talmud, because they tell us how the school was ordered, what its curriculum was, how the study sessions were arranged. And this is the very beginning of this. This is the cause of the assembly is told in brief. The school session was established and set in 2 sessions in the summer and winter. This is exactly the same word. Established, promulgated, that the way in which they organized and arranged their scholastic life was put on display for people to understand. But not only that, it describes its sort of own history within the world of its own religious tradition. And seeing itself as a school, looks back throughout Christian history and sort of understands that Christian history is a sort of set of scholastic procedures, each one of which has collected and arranged a particular kind of doctrine and then promulgated it. Okay? So first they treat sort of classic Greek philosophy. Okay? There was an assembly of those who were called natural philosophers. These 2 establishes the beginning among inanimate elements, right? Speaking really of Plato and Aristotle and trying to figure out how the world exists and to promulgate this system of philosophical engagement such that later folks could understand it and transmit it. Okay, so that's one model for their school. And then now we have a sort of polemical, right? The errant Jews made these assemblies, although they established them on this pretext of being a benefit to themselves and to others. They nevertheless were found from the result of their deeds to be an error, destruction, and ignorant darkness, because all of them together broke the bands of that eternal lordship. Okay, so it's true that that there is polemic, there is sort of nasty things that one community may say about another. But this kind of Syriac Christianity sees that part of its own history is a Jewish history in which Jewish ideas are promulgated or established in this very particular way. And finally, right, speaking of Jesus of Nazareth, when he was 30 years old, Jesus established his teaching. This is the same word. He was misayem, right? He promulgated a particular kind of doctrine. And he renewed the former school, right? If we think about retrojection, which I spoke about in the Talmudic text, you can all see the same thing here, right? That these Syriac Christians are almost retrojecting their own scholastic experience onto that of the disciples, as if it were the same kind of school that they studied in. He established strong definitions of philosophy. He resurrected wisdom, which had died, and gave life to the fear of God, which had ceased. He showed the truth, which had been lost. So we see again and again and again that the terminology of these two kinds of institutions, Jewish on the one hand and Christian on the other hand, share a same kind of terminological vocabulary for what it is that their schools are doing. Right? They are heirs to smaller groups which studied traditional material, and now that they sit in these larger institutions, they collect this kind of material and see it as their job to collate it and to present it to their communities. And I think this really sort of brings me to the comparison with the modern situation. Here you have, in late antiquity, Jewish communities and Christian communities who are relatively free in the Persian milieu, right? There is not a great deal of persecution of religious minorities. Jews and Christians alike are able to found institutions, to fund those institutions where their elite men go to study. And they talk about what goes on in those institutions in strikingly similar ways. Their job is to collate previous information and to promulgate it in ways that their communities can understand. For a very long time, these texts, or these kinds of texts, were studied sort of in radically different silos. That those who studied Talmud didn't know Syriac, and those who studied Syriac couldn't read the Talmud. And so that for at least 150 years of contemporary scholarship, these two corpora of texts weren't compared at all. And yet when you compare them, you see that they talk in such similar ways about their own institutions. And I think that in many ways this could serve as a model for thinking sort of first about how Jews and Catholics in the contemporary American landscape might see each other, right, as similar kinds of religious minorities who are granted a great deal of autonomy and a great deal of religious freedom, who operate in the sort of marketplace of religious ideas. And we shouldn't be surprised that they structure their charitable arms in such similar kinds of ways. I mean, think about the ways the Jewish Federation and Catholic Charities mirror each other in remarkable ways. That Catholic institutions of higher learning and Jewish institutions of higher learning structure themselves in similar ways. And, as I'm so delighted to know as I'm here, where students come and struggle with precisely the same kinds of issues, who are deeply ensconced in their own religious traditions, who deeply love their religious traditions, and yet find them challenging in remarkably similar kinds of ways. And so, as we sort of in the contemporary period, remark on how contemporary Jews and Catholics, and I suppose we could also, in our American context, broaden the comparison, not only to other kinds of Christians, but to other religions as well. Right? Sometimes, I think, and too often, we think that this is sort of unique to modern America. But I think when you look at these texts through this kind of lens, you realize that it's not. In fact, it's really the Middle Ages in which sort of coercive control of one monotheistic religion over another grants us the kind of model of opposition. But if we sort of peel back those medieval layers to this kind of late antique historical context, we see a much more interesting set of comparisons. And so what I'm really arguing is it's not only, right, my two saffron growers who might have, individual Jews and individual Christians who might have gotten along in late antiquity as people who are different always certainly must have. But it's really that these two communities arranged themselves in such similar ways and thought about themselves in such similar kinds of terminologies that I think we could learn something about them. And it's not only in terms of communal situation, but it's also in terms of the way we study. Right? And so much of what we're attempting to do in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies is to really use our own scholastic institution, where we ask these kinds of deep questions about the past and try to figure out who we are and who we want to be and what makes the world tick the way that it does. To really see the study of religions, right, not as siloed investigations into individual kinds of communities, but as the opportunity to really look at things in parallel, and ideally to kind of glean deep truths which could come from one tradition and see how they might be reflected in traditions of another. And I think this is really sort of comes down to the whole point of Mission Week this year, in that we're trying to look towards interreligious understanding for inspired futures, right? It's not purely an intellectual endeavor, although it certainly is that. But ultimately, we're trying to understand that the world is much clearer, that we understand much more about the human tradition, the human condition, right? When we study multiple traditions in parallel and seek to apply some of the learnings we find in one situation to the other. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bickart, for that thought-provoking presentation. How what is old is, what is new is not so new, what is old is not so old. We've got a couple of minutes for a couple of questions, so I'm just going to let Dr. Bickart field those questions, and then I'll interrupt him
when it's time.
When it's time. Okay. So we've got a microphone here.
Just turn it on first. So there are a couple of hands.
Raise your hand and we'll get to as many as possible.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So in modern Hebrew, at least, the word siyum or mesayem means to conclude or to finish. So I was just surprised by the translation of promulgate, and I'm wondering if you can talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, and if you look at that, that's really how this whole project started. It is indeed the case that if you look at traditional dictionaries of the Talmud, that's how they will explain. So for instance, in that interpretation of that verse in 2 Kings, usually it's translated as, let it be concluded that Rabbi Yochanan said this, that, or the other thing. I guess what my thinking is that this particular institution, the siyuma, right, seems to be so much about collating and promulgating. And essentially my claim is that it's really the Syriac meaning of to promulgate, to expound, which has so influenced the Jewish sources, because that's how they're really using it. There's no way to think about the siyuma as a finishing. Nothing is finished, nothing is concluded. It is the promulgation that is the point of these activities. And I think you're probably right. It is true that that sayem in the PL, in good biblical Hebrew, may mean to conclude, although it's a little bit complicated in Hebrew, because exactly what letter it is it a sin or is it a samech, right? Biblical Hebrew and later Hebrews are a little bit strange. But my claim is really that it's the Syriac meaning that has influenced the Jewish Babylonian meaning. And that's why maybe people didn't understand or wanted to apply the Hebrew meaning to these texts, when in fact the Syriac meaning makes much more sense.
Thank you. Your lecture was extremely interesting. I appreciate you taking the time
to
talk with us tonight. So my question has to do with the statement you made about it was in medieval times that the opposition between Christianity and Judaism really developed. And can you speak more to that? And how did it come about? Was it because of people, situations? What started to cause that polarization?
Yeah, so I hope you have another 3 hours, because it's going to take a while. I probably overstated the claim. and I think pretty early in Jewish and Christian interaction, there is a great deal of polemic. So much so that by the 2nd, 3rd century, you get plenty of authors for whom what it means to be quintessentially not Christian is Jewish, and what it means quintessentially to be not Jewish is Christian, right? And so I'm not claiming that there was no polemic or no bifurcation in this way, but until you have political power connected to a single monotheistic tradition, you don't get the same kind of coercive control. Now, sometimes contemporary Jews like to sort of build up Judaism in that we never oppressed Christians or Muslims the way they oppressed us. And I guess that's, in some sense historically true. It's sort of an open question that, had the Roman Empire converted to Judaism as its state religion and not to Christianity, would you not have seen state persecution of Christians? I doubt it, right? I think power corrupts in ways that corrupts everybody. And this is not a talk about contemporary politics, but we could easily move into that realm without too much difficulty, that power is a deeply dangerous thing. This is, among the downsides of monotheism. I mean, monotheists have a great deal of problem with pluralism. That if you think that there's only one God and that your tradition has the truth about that God, then other people who make other claims you're going to see them in particular kinds of ways. So it's really in the post-Constantine world that you see this. By the way, this is yet another reason why studying the Babylonian texts can be so profound. Whereas Jewish rabbinic texts produced in the land of Israel during the Talmudic period, certainly by the time of the Jerusalem Talmud and the big Midrash collections, Genesis Rabbah, Leviticus Rabbah, these kinds of texts, they're really afraid of Christian power. And therefore do not say many of the things they probably think, but in fact seek to sort of hide what it is that they say and think about these others in careful ways. Where the Babylonians, who are under no such political consequences, can come up with all kinds of terrible things to say about their interlocutors, because they're not afraid of what the authorities will do, and that can be a really interesting window into their own kinds of neuroses about the other and what they think about the other and how they try to convince their own community to stay away from the other. And those can be fascinating. By the way, they're fun to teach in my context too. The Babylonian Talmud, right, claims, against what every Jewish kid was ever told in Hebrew school, right, the Babylonian Talmud claims that Jesus was executed not by the Romans, but by the Jews. And that was not crucified, a particularly Roman punishment, but was stoned to death, this quintessentially biblical punishment. This, of course, has nothing to do with history. It's a polemic. But it's really interesting to teach a text like that in a Jewish studies course at John Carroll, which raises all kinds of really interesting and dangerous kinds of ideas.
Yes, thank you so much for such a great presentation. It's hard not to hear everything you're talking about in this, Talmudic to Syriac context, and not think about the diatessaron as a possible way to kind of expand, not in the almost in a parallel way. Do you have any thoughts about sort of just...
Sure. So first of all, the diatessaron is a very famous text. It is what is essentially a Syriac harmonization of the Gospels. So much of, and I guess those of you who study New Testament here, right, among the major ways that the New Testament must be studied in an academic context is comparing the variety of different texts which have a relationship to one another, right? And that relationship isn't always clear, but the Gospels disagree on all kinds of things all the time. So it's fascinating. I mean, one of the ways that these kinds of things are harmonized, of course, is in the liturgy, that nobody ever encounters contradictions between the gospel texts when you hear the lectionary cycle, because you're only reading one gospel at a time. But in Antiquity, these challenges between a variety of different gospels, one solution was to try to harmonize them. In our context, we'd make a movie, right, or something like that. And so the oldest example of this is indeed the Diatessaron, which I don't believe we have all of it. We mostly have a one page, right? Well, we have also we have patristic quotes of it and things like that. I guess from my perspective, it's a little bit early. I mean, the Diatessaron is probably pretty early. Well, we think it's 2nd century, right? And so most of the texts that I'm thinking about are much later. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if we really want to get to the earliest forms of Syriac Christianity, you're absolutely right that it's a text to work on, and therefore is a text that's sort of worth reading, especially because it's sort of at the crossroads of a variety of different fields. The reason why it doesn't come up here is because it's so much earlier than some of the stuff I'm working on.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I have a picky-uni question. In the first story, you mentioned the orla fruit.
Yes.
I believe refers to trees.
Yes.
And crocuses are where saffron comes from.
Ooh.
So how do you reconcile that?
Excellent. Yeah. I have no idea. I mean, yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. The other problem with this is the orla fruit case doesn't really make much sense anyway, given that orla is not in force outside the land of Israel. Within traditional Talmudic Judaism, there is a great distinction between those laws which apply to things inside the biblical land of Israel and those things which do not. Is this evidence of a sort of fanciful scholastic procedure, right? This is the quintessential ivory tower where the people inside the ivory tower don't even know how saffron is grown? Possibly. Is it possible, right? The notion that these are Babylonian folks who seem to be asking a question which would only apply in the land of Israel indicates that it's probably not accurate in any kind of degree, that what they have attempted to do in the story is construct a theoretical case in order to sort of probe the limits of the law. In the same way that the Jesuits are always accused of too much casuistics, right? Too much case law, right? Constructing absurd cases. And my dear colleague, Dr. Bretsky, is giggling here because he knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? In the same way, the Jesuits are often accused of that. Well, it's the same thing the Talmudists are accused of. But I think in both situations, sometimes you construct a case which is, as you point out, it's illogical because we don't care about the practical issue. We care about the theoretical issue and trying to probe what the limits might be of this. And therefore, you might construct a case sometimes that isn't really actually that realistic, but you do so as a way of thinking through the sort of contours of any given issue. And I think that that's probably what's going on here.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Bickart.